30 years ago, A. Bronson, from the artist group General Idea, curated an exhibition at the Power Plant Gallery in Toronto titled From Sea to Shining Sea, Artist-Initiated Activity in Canada, 1939 to 1987. I see the exhibition and the accompanying publication as a kind of manifesto for a certain type of artistic culture. The exhibition catalog, which was co-edited by A. Bronson and Peggy Gale in Toronto, René Bloin in Montreal, and Glenn Lewis in Vancouver, presented a chronology of initiatives across Canada beginning in the late 1930s and culminating in the 1970s in a coast-to-coast network of self-organized galleries and publications. I highly recommend that folks read this chronology. It's an incredible source book for the imagination. Bronson's vision of culture, as presented in his essay for the exhibition catalog, was essentially a network one. That is, culture appeared to be based less on individual figures or institutions than on what arises when one connects the dots between these individualities. And this alludes, I think, to the idea of the relationship between nodes and space that Hank mentioned before the break. Bronson wrote in his catalog text, as an artist writing about museums by artists, about my own history, which is a history beginning in 1968, a Canadian history with elaborately Canadian characters, dreaming the Canadian dream of one community that is a network of communities, sea to sea. What is striking to me in Bronson's description is its tentative tone, its characterization of the cultural network as a kind of dream of community. And it is this dreamlike quality that I understand the word Aether in the title of the symposium. Bronson writes that Canadian artists find themselves, quote, wanting a Canadian art scene just like in New York or London or Paris in the 30s. And yet, Canadian artists are, as he describes, typically unable to picture the reality of a Canadian art scene except as a dream projected upon the national landscape as a sea to shining sea connective tissue. For Bronson, and I continue quoting him, the Canadian dream of one community that is a network of communities appears here as something lacking, as an absence, and therefore as something to desire and to project upon the landscape around us. He describes this community as a dream community connected by and reflected by the media, that is, authenticated by its own reflection in the media. As such, a Canadian artist desiring to see not necessarily himself, but the picture of his art scene pictured on TV, and knowing the impossibility of an art scene without real museums. The Art Gallery of Ontario was not a real museum for us. Without real magazines, and Arts Canada was not a real magazine for us. Without real artists, no, Harold Town was not a real artist for us. And we forgot that we ourselves were real artists because we had not seen ourselves in the media. Real artists like Frank Stella appeared in Art Forum magazine. These are powerful statements, I think, very rich and resonant, and full of ambivalences and nuances. Here it is worth wondering what Bronson means when he writes about the media. I think the tendency today is to make media synonymous with new mass communications technologies like television, video, the internet, etc. And certainly Bronson points us in this direction when he describes the myth of the Canadian artist desiring to see the picture of his art scene pictured on TV. When Bronson refers to the media, however, he is pointing to something broader than simply new media. Media, I believe, is defined as anything that stands between as a mediating channel conducive to a network culture. For Bronson, the media is a means of fabricating a tissue. That is, a means for constructing a dream of community projected upon the national landscape as a sea to shining sea connective tissue. This idea of media is evident in the culture that took shape within the Correspondence Art Network, the international network of artists who produce and exchange artistic activity using an already existing channel of communication, the mail, as a ready-made conduit for fabricating a tissue. In her essay, Alternative Traditions in the Contemporary Arts, Subjugated Knowledges and the Balance of Power, the author Esther Millman describes it in this way. She writes, "The primary definition characteristic of all correspondence art networks is that they are communication cultures. In their pure transitive state, outside the museum, gallery, and alternative space system, correspondence works are overtly transactional. They serve as a means by which a community is established and through which members of the culture interact. There are many instances of projects in Canadian art that adopt this transactional character described by Millman in order to achieve what A.A. Bronson describes as the act of projecting a dream of community upon the landscape." And I'll just give a glance over a few of them. From Bill Vazan's project Intercommunication Lines from 1968 to 2002, to his own project Contacts of 1971 and 1973. This is the cover of the bookwork that documents what is actually a correspondence or network art project. There's a short text in the book, and it has the following words. "The photo contact sheets, their excerpts and other material collected in this book, are the responses to a request list circulated via a postal network of contacts between many people on a global scale." I also think about Vera Frankel's project String Games, Improvisations for Intercity Video, Montreal-Toronto of 1974, which was a live video transmission from Bell Canada's teleconferencing studios in Montreal and Toronto that accumulated a playback at Montreal's Galerie Espace 5 gallery. And also connecting to Roy Kuyuka's 1971 project, Long Beach to Peggy's Cove, that documents his cross-country journey from British Columbia to Nova Scotia, and seems to me emblematic of the spirit of cross-country exchange of the Vancouver-Halifax exchange that Kuyuka organized in 1971. Michael Morris's Nothing by Mouth project of 1971 was produced as a contribution to Dana Atchley's correspondence project, Space Atlas. It was a publication, so Space Atlas was a publication assembling approximately 100 mail art contributions from over 120 participants working in 7 countries. No copies of this publication project would be available for sale, as only its contributors would receive copies. Michael Morris described the project in this way. Dana invited people that he knew around his network to send him 100 self-made pages. He assembled all these things, packaged it, and sent a copy out to people who had participated. 100 copies for 100 people. It was all sent out and everybody saw what each other was doing. Our image bank pages were perforated postcards on a page, postcards that could be used. They were invitations to send original postcards to our image bank postcard show, which was also in 1971. So these pages were building image bank. In my eyes, this is really an exemplary instance of how the network works. of the connect the dots impulse that Millman described as the network's overtly transactional methodology. So Dana Atchley's original invitation resulted in the creation and submission of 100 artistic responses, which he then collected together and sent back to the artists who had replied. But what's interesting is that each of these replies, in principle, could act as yet more invitations to further participation, thus creating a decentered network of creative activity. What I want to highlight right now is Morris's idea of mediation. This phrase, nothing by mouth, as the postcard says, suggests that the network method entails a move away from the immediacy of the mouth, the organic proximity and intimacy of mouth-to-mouth communication. General Ideas image request manipulating the self similarly adopt strategies of transactionality that are so characteristic of correspondence art. But the project shifts the focus from the mouth to the hand. I'll read out this text just for the sake of those who can't are too far away to read it. Manipulating the self, phase 1, a borderline case. The head is separate. The hand is separate. Body and mind are separate. The hand is a mirror for the mind. Wrap your arm over your head, lodging your elbow behind, and grabbing your chin with your hand. The act is now complete. Held, you are holding. You are object and subject, viewed and voyeur. I'd like to ask, what is at stake in this movement from the mouth to the hand that frames the head? We recall that A. Bronson described the conundrum in this way. On one side, we have a Canadian story with elaborately Canadian characters, dreaming the Canadian dream of one community that is a network of communities, sea to sea. And on the other side, we have a Canadian artist desiring to see not necessarily himself, but the picture of his art scene pictured on TV. To appropriate the metaphors of this symposium, I propose that the question hinges on a struggle between the dematerialized ether of a dream community that is a network of communities, a cloud-like community that operates without an image of itself reflected to itself, and on the other hand, the grounded materiality of an underground community able to see an image of itself as an art scene reflected in the infrastructure of artists' own media. And I think this juxtaposition that I'm trying to articulate maps in intriguing ways with Vincent's presentation of the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. I think there's interesting ways to think about that. That kind of overlay. As General Idea says, the act is now complete. Held, you are holding. You are object and subject, viewed and voyeur. So General Idea sent out this request and they received 112 responses, which were published in a book work in 1971. And it was very nice to see Joni has a copy of it on her library shelf. And 61 of the responses were included in an offset lithograph print that was published in 1973. So these are the submissions that General Idea received from people in their network to this request of manipulating the self. Interestingly, when the lithograph was published, 5 copies of the print were altered by the publisher, Roger Bellemare of Galerie Bay in Montreal, with the approval of General Idea. Bellemare crossed out the word self in pencil on the title and wrote scene, so that the print's title became rendered as manipulating the scene. To my eyes, this intervention conveys the idea that the transition from the mouth to the hand is synonymous with the transition from an ethereal community able to exist without an image of itself, to a community grounded in mirroring devices of its own making. I derived this phrase, organs of reality, from the author Ernst Cassirer, who wrote about mythology, not so much as representations of reality, but rather he describes that myths are organs of reality. We can conceive of General Ideas File magazine, published from 1972 to 1989, as the grounding of the ether in a work of media infrastructure. In the editorial text published in the second issue, we find the following words. We began as a mirror of sorts, a trans-Canada organ of communication within the art scene, a way of looking at the scene and oneself within it. We are a node on the correspondence network, and file is evidence of correspondence that passes through General Idea headquarters, friends, visitors, mail, gossip. I find this interesting gesture of kind of grounding the ether in a specific location, right? File is the evidence of the material that passes through one physical node in the network. So definitely moving away from a kind of ether cloud metaphor to something grounded in a specific place that is but a node in something larger and invisible. As A. Bronson described the Canadian scenario within which File took place in the Sea to Shining Sea catalog, the Canadian configuration, these are his words, is of course a line 5,000 miles long and 100 miles deep, the pattern of inhabited Canada nestling innocently against the belly of the American border, nurtured by the aggressive foreplay of American magazines, American radio, American television, all portraying for us reality as something our American husband does at work, a great turmoil of masculine sweaty activity on the other side of the border, while we, the great white princess, protected by our snow-white blanket of inactivity and our good manners, wait to be stimulated by these muscular reports of the real world, we who are so good at watching and listening. Like the hand that frames the head, File renders subjects into objects. It transformed the network participants into branded personas able to circulate in a stream of commerce by artists. This, I think, is the obvious part played by File, and it is congruent with General Idea's own famous declaration of their desire to be famous, glamorous, and rich. Less obviously, however, and I think crucially, File enabled passive spectators, the great white princesses, to become creators of their own images. It rendered objects into subjects, into artists who, to paraphrase the author Margaret Atwood, choose to write from the center of their own experience and not from the periphery of someone else's. In June 1974, General Idea visited Vancouver to present Blocking, a performance at the Western Front, where the audience's role, including entrances, exits, and audience reactions, was fully choreographed as part of the performance. A film of the event was shot by Byron Black and edited by Vincent Trasov, with music by Hank Bull. General Idea extended this idea of the audience rehearsal in 1978. So they revisited this idea of the audience rehearsal later in 1978 in their performance Towards an Audience Vocabulary that was presented in the Fifth Network 5e Réseau National Video Conference in Toronto. General Idea rehearsed their local audience in the appropriate audience responses characteristic of a real audience. Fern Bayer described the performance in this way. She wrote, General Idea used the television-style studio format in which 36 local Toronto celebrities were placed on stage in the concert hall of the Masonic Temple, performing the various audience responses, wearing the censor sunglasses, laughing, gasping, booing, sleeping, clapping, and standing ovation. It left the real audience confused about their own role and conscious of that fact. Eventually, at the end, the real audience gave their standing ovation to the performance's own standing ovation. There's something interesting, I think, about the Raymond Boisjoli connection of this kind of the limit of transmission and kind of what happens when you become conscious or aware that there is a limit. So, in other words, I believe that general idea can dream the audience, but it does so only on condition that it dreams of an inorganic audience. That is to say, that it's an audience that emerges not spontaneously, not immediately, not naturally from its own culture, but rather it emerges artificially, theatrically, out of its own lack of artistic culture. Following Michael Morris's concept of nothing by mouth, the audience in General Ideas Project undergoes a mediatization of itself. An artifice is introduced so that it stands between the audience, splitting the audience into two. A factical audience, that is the people who attended the audience, who attended the performance, and a performing audience that consists of members of General Ideas' own artistic scene in Toronto. When the performing audience reflects the factical audience, it does so not to reveal the audience as it is, but to reveal it as what it is not. I'm going to make reference to another work by General Idea titled Show Cards that refers to this performance of the audience vocabulary. I'll read out the text that's found in Show Cards. Audience vocabulary, booing, meanings. To the TV audience, we disapprove. To the live audience, we are pulling the rug from under our own feet. To General Idea, they are defining the walls of the pavilion by indicating the limits of their tolerance. Such reactions lead to lively floor plans. Audience vocabulary, standing ovation, meanings. To the TV audience, Miss General Idea 1984 is revealed. To the live audience, we are releasing the tensions created by our own expectations. To General Idea, they are applauding their own performance. This operation is sweeping them to a new point of view. Now they control their activity and they are standing up to applaud this realization. To conclude, for General Idea, I believe nothing by mouth became the means by which a lack or an absence gets swept towards a new point of view. Nothing by mouth became the pragmatic strategy by which artists take control of their own activities and transition from an angelic ethereality defined by pure potential and pure transitionality, transitiveness, and transition to a grounded performativity defined by their own frames of reference. The standing ovation is, as General Idea reminds us, the moment of applauding the realization of this transition. Thanks so much.